One reader writes, I think there is a big barrier to getting across rationalist, atheist, free-thinking arguments against religion. And it's the fact that religious people generally think that they and their religion are doing good things for good reasons, even when they're actually doing horrible things. For instance, oppressing women and homosexuals, spreading lies about contraception, hindering scientific progress, etc. So how can we even hope to get across to them the damage that their views cause when they think they're actually being good and being motivated by good reasons, and that we're the ones who are wrong? So it's a good question. It points to the fact that most people, most of the time, are actually motivated to be good. I mean, it's not there a lot of evil mustache twirling people who think that they're consciously aware that they're being evil and just wanting to harm people. As Steven Weinberg, the physicist, pointed out, good people, without religion, good people will still be good, bad people will still be bad, but to get good people to do bad things, that often requires religion. I think that's often true, that nowhere do we see people, good people, normal people, people who really do love their kids and people who really do want to live in good societies, do needlessly stupid things that cause immense amounts of human misery, but for religion and its otherworldly motives. It's just it manages to subvert very simple projects and drain away energy that could be used for creating a better life in this world in a way that I think would be unimaginable but for any other ideology. And so what to do about this? I think really there really are only two things we can do. We have to undermine the truth claims of religion. We have to call into question the beliefs that motivate good people to do harmful things. So, if the belief that homosexuality is an abomination destined to be punished by a wrathful God who finds it loathsome. Many, many millions of people believe this. They believe this because of their religious doctrines. They weren't born into this world believing it. This is an ideology that gets drummed into them early in life. If our religions were different, this belief would go away. If there were a line in the Bible which said, if all the homophobic passages of the Bible were removed and they were replaced by lines which said, well, men can love men and women can love women, we wouldn't have a problem with homophobia. So this is an ideology, and what it creates is this, just look at the results in our society. At the level of individuals, we have people by the millions who suffer total isolation in their communities, who are convinced that their parents and their friends will cease to love them if they knew they were gay. And even more horribly, they're right about that in many cases. And I hear from these people by the thousands in emails. So these are not parents who are disposed to hate their children. These are parents who have an ideology that causes them to hate their children in many cases, or to fear that their children are going to hell. So this destroys relationships, and then it also subverts our political discourse in ways that should otherwise be unthinkable. The fact that we have to argue about gay marriage and not talk about poverty or nuclear proliferation or climate change or anything else of great consequence. So we have to undermine the beliefs, and we also have to talk about the consequences of the needless complication that is occasioned by the beliefs. So that's really the two things I think that need to be focused on in order to undercut this. What would you say to a non-believer whose husband or wife or entire family is deeply religious? What can they do to mitigate all the conflict that arises at the boundary between belief and disbelief, especially when it comes to deciding how to raise children? So this is, again, this is something that I hear daily in my inbox. This is the people who either can't come out of the closet as non-believers or are out of the closet and then reaping the whirlwind of consequences for doubting God within a community where everyone believes. And the amount of anguish born of this is just amazing. Now, I haven't had this experience. I can't really advise people in any intelligent way based on my own direct experience. But I just think this is something. Depending on the circumstance, this can be a deal breaker. It does end relationships. It does end marriages. Whether it needs to in every case, I certainly doubt. I mean, it's a matter of how tenaciously and dogmatically and intolerantly believers want to hold on to their certainty and insist that children be raised with a fear of hell, for instance. I mean, that would be a deal breaker for me. You know, the idea that to be with someone who insisted upon instilling in our child a fear of eternal torment in hell, you know, I view that as child abuse. So if that's the situation you're in, well, that's a problem, and I don't really have a magic bullet for fixing it. But there are many gradations of that, and clearly when the relationships matter enough and there's enough love and understanding there, enough goodwill, despite differences, then I think some of these impasses can be negotiated. But it's a huge and completely unnecessary problem. The alternative would be just to speak rationally and openly about what, in fact, we know about the nature of the universe, and to never hesitate to admit what we don't know. And that spirit of open-mindedness would just nullify all of these sectarian certainties of religion, and allow people to still explore whatever is there to be found in terms of spiritual life or mystical experience or anything else that could be actually of interest to people in their lives. Please talk about raising children without religion. For instance, in the absence of religious belief, how can you talk to a child about death? Well, this is a circumstance that everyone runs into who's a parent. I actually haven't yet because my daughter is still young enough not to be aware of death. But there's this taboo in our society around admitting we don't know things. Now, it's not just with respect to children, but you see this everywhere in political discourse, and it's happily and ironically the one thing that is unique about scientific discourse is that people are without hesitation committed to saying they don't know when they don't know, because the penalty for pretending to know things you don't know is huge. So you have scientists rather often saying, I don't know this, I'm not an expert about this, someone else in the room knows more about this than I do, and you get this kind of humility which actually doesn't export very well into the rest of the culture, because then you get lots of people saying, look, science doesn't know anything. So but for the rest of culture, people tend to feel very uncomfortable having to admit when they don't know something, and they're uncomfortable with their kids. They don't model for their kids this ability to just admit that you don't know, and that seems to me to be a problem. It's actually the basis for exploring anything, honestly, to admit that you don't know. Now, with death, I can honestly say I don't know what happens after death. There are reasons to be skeptical of survival of death. There's certainly reasons to be skeptical of any specific story about survival. But in terms of the relationship between consciousness and the physical world, I'm not in a position to say, oh yeah, I know exactly what happens after death. You are zeroed out in precisely the way you were zeroed out before your birth. Now, there are good reasons to believe that's true based on what we know about the brain, but this is not a matter of scientific certainty, and if consciousness were in some ways independent of the brain, I wouldn't expect the world to appear much differently or any differently than it does now. We just simply, there is a mystery to consciousness. But I don't see the giving of false promises and false fears to children to be paying any kind of dividends that we want to conserve in our culture. To put in the minds of children a fear of something bad happening after death seems to me to be manifestly unethical, to give them this false hope placeholder that everyone goes to heaven and hangs out for eternity, is to fail to equip them to grieve and to actually and fail. It's a failure to be honest in the face of mystery. So I think we can honestly say we don't know what happens. We can honestly represent the reasons to not be afraid of non-existence. To be afraid of non-existence after death makes no more sense than being afraid of your non-existence prior to birth. You're not you didn't suffer your absence in the 18th century, and you're not going to suffer your absence in the 22nd century. So that's also something that, in an age-appropriate way, we can communicate to children. So I just don't admitting your gradations of certainty on everything you talk about seems to me to be virtually always a good thing, even with young children. How does your notion of the moral landscape incorporate the intrinsic value of human life, or the intrinsic value of the natural world? Your emphasis on well-being, on the conscious experience of conscious creatures, would seem to suggest that people who are capable of the greatest happiness or produce the greatest benefit for others are more valuable than other people. But many people would view this inequality as ethically offensive. So your view also seems to suggest that nature has no value unless people are there to experience it. So please clarify this. Well, it's true that I have linked kind of moral worth to the possibilities of experience. And the more experience, the richer the experience, the deeper the experience, the more worth. So that is when asking why we're more important than insects, it goes down to the nature of the possible experience, the possible happiness we could be deprived of, the possible suffering that could be inflicted on us. Insofar as this is a much greater range of experience, then it's worse to deprive us of happiness or inflict suffering on us than it is in the case of insects. So this, as the questioner points out, kind of migrates inconveniently into our own species. So unless you're going to draw the line and say that all human beings are precisely equal to all others, you're left with this kind of weird calculus that what about the really, really happy, really smart, really creative, really wealthy, really connected people versus those who are the antithesis of all those things? I think it's true that there are circumstances in which we might want to acknowledge that some people are more important than others. Some people are more important than others. If we have a hostage crisis and the President of the United States is one of the hostages, well then that hostage crisis is going to get a lot more attention than any other, for good reason, given his responsibilities, given the consequences of having the leader of the lone superpower held hostage. When we think about a hostage crisis, we don't tend to make other calculations, however. Like we don't think about, well, who's the smartest, richest, most creative person in there? You know, do we rescue the smart people before the people who aren't so smart? There's a good reason not to do that, even though in the end we can talk about differences between people, because we all value fairness so much, and the consequences of having a fair society, a society that's blind to the differences between people, a society that treats all human life as though it were precisely equivalent, that is of obvious benefit to almost all of us all of the time. So you can point to situations in which you want to strip off the veil of ignorance there and say, oh no, we have to talk specifically about these people and why they are so important, as in the case of the president, say.